ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music, and more.
Skeletons can't speak, but they can tell you quite a lot about a person. Professor Alice Roberts wants us to listen to skeletons. She is an anatomist with a love of archaeology and bones, and she says our life stories are written in our bones. They can tell the stories of our health, our diet, sometimes what we did for a living, and in some cases, how we died. Like, did we die violently, or from disease, or from terrible misadventure? In Alice's new book, Crypt, she brings us the histories of hundreds of people who died between 5 and 10 centuries ago. There's the sad and gothic tale of the Anchoress who lived alone, walled up inside of a tiny room in a medieval church. Then there are the lives of sailors who drowned when a ship called the Mary Rose, which was owned by Henry VIII, sunk in 1545. And then there are the bones left behind after a terrible massacre ordered by a king in the year 1004 AD. Hello, Alice.
Hello.
When did your fascination with bones begin?
Do you know, I think it started quite early on. I mean, I was one of those kids that would, pick up bird skulls and be fascinated with them, find the odd rodent bone and be really fascinated with that. And I was also fascinated with the way that the human body was put together. And I had an amazing pop-up book when I was about 10, which was written by the fantastic Jonathan Miller, the physician and polymath. But also a pop-up artist as well. And it was this incredible pop-up book of human anatomy. So I think from a very early age, I was interested in all of this. I was interested in biology, anatomy, how humans are put together, where humans have come from. And then I went on to be a medical student and then a doctor, but then got drawn back into the whole world of anatomy and became a university academic. So I think I've always been interested in anatomy, but bones in particular, yeah.
And when you were an academic teaching at Bristol University, I understand there was like a collection of medieval bones that were kept in the basement there. Is that right?
Yeah, this is when I started to get into looking at archaeological human remains, so looking at archaeological bones and actually realising that you can tell an awful lot from them. And that actually came as a surprise to me as a doctor. So at that point in time, I was a young surgeon. I was teaching anatomy at Bristol University. I wasn't expecting to stay in anatomy. I was expecting to go on to a surgical career, but I just got sucked in. Mm-hmm. There was a fantastic group of researchers there, all women. They took me under their wing. A wonderful woman called Louise Lowe showed me how to lay out these skeletons, and we would go down into the basement of the Bristol Royal Infirmary and lay out these skeletons. And it was just a revelation to me as a doctor how much you could tell from the bones, because I was thinking, how am I going to approach this? I can't ask this person where it hurts. I can't take a medical history from them. I can't take blood. Oh, I can do x-rays. At least there's that link with the clinical. But actually, there's an awful lot you can tell just by looking at the bones, actually, the surface of them. So a lot of the work that I've done over the years is about examining archaeological human remains. And I suppose because I'm a doctor, I'm particularly interested in pathology. I'm particularly interested in evidence of disease and injury on those bones.
With those bones at the basement of Bristol University, what were you able to learn about who those people were and what happened to them?
It was a really fascinating collection of bones, actually, which came from a place called Barton-on-Humber in northern England. I was looking at those bones with an amazing woman, paleopathologist, so she studied diseases in the past, Juliet Rogers, and she was looking in particular at patterns of arthritis through those skeletons. So I became part of her research team looking at that. One of the big things that we found actually in that collection was that rates of arthritis have changed through time, which we didn't anticipate would be the case.
Gotten worse or better?
Well, it was really the difference between particularly hip and knee osteoarthritis. So what we saw was that going back into the Middle Ages, so this was a medieval collection of bones, that hip osteoarthritis was much more common than knee, and that's completely different today. So today, knee osteoarthritis is much more prevalent than hip osteoarthritis.
Do we know why?
Yeah, so that's interesting, isn't it? Because this is how science works. You have a finding and you go, why? Yeah. Exactly. It's not genetic. We know it's not genetic. So there hasn't been a massive, genetic change that means that suddenly, humans are somehow different from just 500 years ago and therefore experiencing osteoarthritis. So it's all to do with how we use our bodies. We haven't got to the bottom of it, but we think it's probably because of increasing sedentism. So basically, we're not using our bodies as much as people were using their bodies back in the Middle Ages.
We're sitting at our desks.
So we're sitting at our desks, and that's very bad for our knees. Actually, it's bad for our hips as well. We shouldn't. I mean, we're here sitting on chairs. We should probably be sitting cross-legged on the floor.
Oh, right,
Much
not
better
standing
for us.
even, just sitting cross-legged.
Standing as much as you can, definitely, but also putting your joints through that full range of motion. We don't very often, in modern living, you can avoid putting your hips and knees through the full range of motion quite easily. If you think when you're sitting in a chair, your knee's only at 90 degrees, you're not bending it completely. So again, it's use it or lose it. Use your joints and use them through the full range of motion.
How is the technology allowing us to read bones changed in recent years?
Oh my God, well, this is the transformative thing. And this is why I wanted to write this series of books at this time, is that there's a massive revolution happening. And the revolution is ancient DNA. So we are now able to extract DNA from incredibly ancient bones, and it's becoming used more and more in archaeology. So this involves taking actually quite small samples of bone from skeletons and extracting the DNA, which comes out as tiny fragments, reconstructing those fragments into an entire genome. So we're now in the era of archaeogenomics. We are reading entire ancient genomes, and that is telling us so much about the past. I mean, it's utterly incredible. We can look at individuals in a cemetery and we can see family relationships. That from DNA. People can get their DNA tested today and find long lost relatives. You can do exactly the same with archaeological human remains. You can find family relationships in cemeteries. We can find family relationships between individuals who are not in the same cemetery. We're also able to, for instance, look at population change through time. So we're able to, there's particularly interesting cultural change in ancient Britain as we get into the Bronze Age. So if we go from the Neolithic, when people were farming, so at the end of the Stone Age, through to the beginning of the Metal Age, where you've got the Copper Age and then the Bronze Age, and there's this new culture that we see arriving in Britain about 4,500 years ago, which involves a different style of burial, going from communal burials to individual burials with very beautiful little pots, often placed in the grave. We also see this evidence of metalworking at the same time. There's a whole kind of package of culture which seems to appear very suddenly in Britain. And archaeologists had kind of debated about this over the decades, going, well, maybe there's a big population change, and or maybe it's just a few people coming into Britain from mainland Europe, bringing these new ideas with them. But they actually couldn't get to the bottom of that without the evidence. And the evidence that you need is the DNA evidence. So if you look at the genomes of the Neolithic farmers, say from 5,000 years ago, and then we look at the DNA of the Bronze Age people, so we have burials from the Bronze Age and we can extract the DNA from those individuals. That's about 4,500 years ago. What we can then say is, do they look like the direct descendants of the farmers, or do they look like new people coming into Britain? And it was a bit incendiary when the first bit of research in this area was published, and that was back in 2018. And it really set the cat among the pigeons, because the archaeologists had fairly much settled on an idea that not many people had come over at the beginning of the Bronze Age. And then the geneticists said, well, actually, there's a 90% population replacement in Britain at the beginning of the Bronze Age. So, it's absolutely phenomenal. So it's really helping us do that bigger picture stuff, looking at population change, migration over time, which, has just happened throughout history and prehistory. There's always been migration. And it's also allowing us to look in that more fine, detailed way at family relationships within cemeteries. And then the other thing, and the thing which got me particularly excited, because I'm a doctor originally, was that we can look at not just the DNA of humans, but the DNA of pathogens, the DNA of viruses, bacteria that have infected people in the past. So we can actually look at disease through time using these genetic methods.
Yeah, it feels like an incredible form of time travel almost, to be able to peer into the past and find out more detail what actually happened.
Yeah, it is amazing. I'm so stunned by how much we can do now. I think 20 years ago, most people working in this kind of area, most doctors, most biologists, most geneticists even, wouldn't have been able to anticipate just how much we can do and how transformative it would be. And it's telling us a lot about the past. So we're seeing evidence of disease that we'd never even seen before, because a lot of diseases kill you without leaving a trace on the body, especially diseases that kill you quickly. So things like the plague. If people died of the plague, as a paleopathologist, somebody who studies bone, looking at the bone, x-raying it, I can't see the plague. It's killed someone too quickly to leave any bony changes. But my geneticist friends can. So they can take samples from skeletons which look on the face of it completely healthy, paradoxically. But when they actually extract the DNA and look at it, they're able to find evidence of that pathogen DNA. So we've shown that the Black Death is Yersinia pestis. It's this very specific pathogen. We've shown that actually the 6th century Justinianic plague that ripped through the Byzantine Empire, that we have good documentary evidence for. We didn't know what that pathogen was. We know it's something nasty, but again, it's Yersinia pestis. And now actually we have the plague, the Black Death, going right back into prehistory. We know it was there in the Bronze Age. We know it was there in the Neolithic. It keeps coming back. It's a bit of a sanguine lesson for us looking at diseases today when we think they've gone away, that if we've let diseases become endemic, they can pop up again. So,
lesson to learn.
It's a bit of a lesson to learn, isn't it?
Let's talk about some of the specific skeletons you cover in the book Crypt. And I want to talk about one that was found in an odd little grave in a church in York. This was of a woman who died in 1448. Firstly, what was so odd and interesting about this particular grave?
Well, so we think she died in 1448 or around that time, but that's actually jumping ahead in the story. So this is an excavation that takes place in York, in an area of York called Fishergate, and it was a church and a cemetery. So, of course, the archaeologists know that they're going to find burials, and they find lots and lots of burials in that cemetery, hundreds of burials in that cemetery. But the one that really caught the eye of the osteoarchaeologist, that's the person that focuses on looking at bones from archaeological sites, Lauren McIntyre, was this unusual burial that was inside the church. And at that point, you think, okay, this is either somebody who is clerical, who's something to do with the church itself, or somebody very important in that society. Those are the kinds of people that get buried inside medieval churches. They knew it was medieval, at least. But it was a really odd burial. Most medieval burials are laid out in an extended position, like somebody's lying down, in the ground, with their hands over their chest or maybe folded over their pelvis. This one was kind of on the side and in a semi-crouched position. Really odd. I think if you'd found it away from the church and just in the countryside, you'd think it was probably a Bronze Age burial, because that style of posture was much more common in the Bronze Age. So it was odd right from the start. And then when Lauren got the bones back to the lab and she'll clean them up and lay them out and look at them, there were lots of changes in the skeleton which caught her eye. But also she was able to link this particular burial up with some historical documents. So this is when it got really interesting.
How did the bones feel when you held them in your hands?
Well, there were certainly unusual features in the bones, but one of the first things you do when you look at a skeleton, when you lay it out and you're examining an archaeological skeleton, is you're looking for indicators of the age of the individual when they died. So we could see that this was an adult person. So you can see that the bones were fully fused. You can see that the teeth had worn down, and you're looking at somebody who was probably in middle age. And then the next thing you can do is start to look at the shape and size of the bones, but also particular features, especially in the pelvis, which help us to differentiate between male and female skeletons. So this looked like a female skeleton. So we know we're dealing with an adult woman.
I'm just trying to imagine what they look like. Would they have been disintegrated looking, or what did you see when you were looking at these bones?
They're fairly well preserved bones, actually. The skull has not been preserved. But the actual bones themselves are fairly well preserved. So you're looking at a nice skeleton which you can kind of lay out, and you've got a good representation of a lot of the bones of the body. So you lay them all out, make an inventory of what you've got, start to look for those signs of the age of the individual, the sex of the individual, and then the next thing is you start to look for signs of pathology.
And so what do we know about who this woman was?
Well, the interesting documentary evidence that Lauren McIntyre managed to find was that there had been a woman who was associated with this church in a big way in the 15th century. And we know about this woman because of records of her will. And we've got this record of her will being proven in 1448. And it also mentions, it doesn't just say there's this woman who, lives in this area. It actually mentions her being an anchorite. And we have a name. So she's called Lady Isabella German. So Lady Isabella German was an anchorite in the Church of Fishergate. It was the church that was being investigated.
And what is an anchorite?
Well, this is the really fascinating thing. So in the Middle Ages, there was a bit of a fad for these hermits who essentially were holed up, walled up inside churches. It seems like such an odd thing to us today to do. But there was a real kind of trend for people who were removing themselves from society, and they were literally being enclosed in a cell in a church. So walled up, they couldn't get in or out. Once they were in, they were in. There would be a small window that they could use to communicate with the outside world, and presumably people could pass food into them, and they could pass stuff out. And that's it. They were isolated, but also in a weirdly public way, because people would know. They would have known that Isabella German was an anchoress at Fishergate. They wouldn't be able to see her. You weren't allowed to see an anchoress or an anchorite. They had to have a black curtain hanging over their window. But it was like having a living saint in the church. It's a very curious thing.
This is fascinating. I mean, it sounds like a torturous existence, but what would they have spent their days doing alone in this tiny room in a church?
Well, that's an interesting question, because there's actually a handbook called the Anchoress. And the Anchoress, if you have this idea that your career ambition is to become an anchoress,
very much not, but sure, tell me.
You've got a nifty little handbook which will help you out. And basically the handbook says it's really important to keep yourself busy so that you don't do naughty things. And you can keep yourself busy by doing things like mending clothes for the poor, also digging your own grave with your hands. So you're going to stay in that cell until you die, and then you're going to die in it, and you're going to bury yourself, basically.
So your job is to dig your own grave?
Your job is to dig your own grave.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
And so, presumably they would have had a fair amount of social contact, because as you said, there's a little window where perhaps food would have been passed through, but if they're sewing clothes for the poor, someone's bringing them cloth, would they have spent a bit of time talking to someone?
Well, this is when it gets very strange, I think, and it's very difficult to peer back through time and to establish exactly what was going on in the Middle Ages. I mean, there are bizarre practices like this where, on the one hand, we're told that these were people who were isolated from society and weren't allowed to talk to anyone. But then on the other hand, there's documentary evidence that some of them had handmaids. And you go, well, I'm not sure how that works. And then with some anchoresses, we know that they could come and go.
Oh, they could leave. Okay.
Yes. So it was maybe a day job and they could go home at the end of the day. I mean, certainly it was a good thing for the church. I mean, the church would make a lot of money out of having an anchoress or an anchorite because you had this living saint. It basically it's a bit of PR for the church. So you'd have more pilgrims coming to the church. You'd have more people donating. And actually what we've got again at Fishergate is evidence from other wills. So there's 7 other wills that date to around that time that say that people are leaving money to the church. And they're leaving money to the church because of Isabella German. So the church is using her as a bit of PR.
One detail I loved reading about was the fact that anchoresses were allowed a cat for company.
Yes.
The original childless cat lady.
It is,
the truck goes that far.
It totally is. I mean, it's very, very strange. And it's very difficult to get to the bottom of exactly what was going on with all these people. And I suspect it was very diverse. What we don't have a lot of, what's been a slight blind spot for historians as well, and I say this coming at this area of history as not a trained historian myself, but as a doctor, what we don't have a lot of is real evidence or actually real investigations into what was going on in terms of mental health and looking after people with mental health issues. And I'm sure there would have been a mental health dimension to this. I mean, you're talking about something which seems very unusual to us today. And yes, the Middle Ages is a different world. It's, there's a whole different culture. But it's an odd thing to do, to remove yourself from society at any point in human history. That's an odd thing to do. So I'm sure there would have been some individuals for whom mental health issues would have been part of this whole story.
And so coming back to Isabella's bones, what were you able to learn about her life by looking at her bones?
Well, this is the really interesting thing when it came to those bones, was that they were absolutely riddled with disease. So there's a couple of fragments of the skull which are very kind of moth-eaten in appearance, and then there are long bones from the leg which have these very characteristic cavities within them. And they appear as cavities today. Of course, while she was alive, they wouldn't have been cavities. And it's evidence of a very particular disease which in the fullness of time does move into the bones as well. And
which disease?
We're pretty sure that this is syphilis.
Right. So she had syphilis.
She had syphilis. And, she by the time it gets into your bones, this is advanced syphilis. So it's tertiary syphilis. By the time you see it in somebody's bones, it's everywhere else in their body as well.
Would it have been very painful?
Yes, it is painful. Yeah. And also it, as I said, it gets into all the tissues of your body, including the brain. So in the really advanced stages of the disease, it will cause serious psychiatric issues.
Do we know if this is what would have killed her then?
This is always the kind of crunch question with osteoarchaeology. It's very, very rare that we can point to the cause of death. What we can certainly say is that she had advanced syphilis at the point that she died. We don't know if it's actually what killed her. It could have been what killed her.
Was syphilis quite common at the time?
Yeah, it was common. So we're talking about a sexually transmitted disease, obviously, that really does actually surge in the 15th and 16th centuries. It is very common, yeah. And also what's interesting, but also quite horrifying in a way when you look at those bones, is that you are looking at a disease that, as somebody started to suffer with it, they probably knew what was happening.
Right.
So once you start to get the full-blown effects of syphilis, you know what the trajectory is. And in the Middle Ages, the trajectory is clear, that it is just going to continue advancing. And that's such a different world to the world that we're in now, because this is treatable today. This is something you can treat with antibiotics.
Yeah.
In the pre-antibiotic era, it's basically a death sentence.
Right. And so if this was Isabella German, could she have known that she had syphilis at the time she went in to become an anchoress? And do you think shame could have driven her to make that decision? Shame about having the disease?
I think this is a really interesting question, because we don't know that kind of process. We don't know whether she was deciding to become an anchoress or whether people around her were deciding that would be the best thing for her. We don't know that with many anchorites and anchoresses, in fact, apart from the odd one where we have much more in terms of biographical details and letters from them. But with Lady Isabella German, you can certainly think of a number of scenarios, and I think that's the best way to approach it. I, again, approach it as a doctor would approach the diagnosis of a disease. You don't rush to one conclusion and go, this is what must have happened. You think of lots of different scenarios, and then you can try to refine those and work out which was more probable. But I think in some ways with Lady Isabella German, we can't actually do that. So you can think about the possibilities, just imagine how people might have reacted individually to having that disease, and then how people around that individual might have reacted to them having that disease. And certainly we know that, syphilis carried a stigma with it. It's a sexually transmitted disease. It's also a disease where people know what the outcome is going to be, that if it turns into advanced syphilis, it's going to be quite horrendous for them. So you can certainly imagine a scenario where Lady Isabella German's family might have thought, well, actually, she'd be much better off being looked after in the church. And that could have been an altruistic motive behind that, or it could have been that actually they would prefer somebody else to take her off their hands. It could have been that Lady Isabella German had the neuropsychiatric effects of syphilis, and that led her to make this, what does seem to us today to be a rather strange choice, to be holed up in a church. So that could have been a possibility. it could have been a possibility that actually she was suffering from an earlier form of the disease. So she was acting very rationally at that point and thinking, well, I know I've got syphilis. It hasn't started to actually impact on the surface of my body in a way that everybody else knows yet. And I think I'm going to remove myself from society because of that stigma and that shame. So I think any of those scenarios, and there are probably more that people could think about as well, could have played into this story.
This is Conversations with Sana Kadar.
Another set of bones you write about belonged to a group of sailors who had been on a ship called the Mary Rose, which sank in 1545. How did you come to see these bones?
I've seen those through the process of filming, actually. And the first time I saw them was back in 2010. So I present a series on the BBC called Digging for Britain. It's a lovely series. Every year I get to go out and look at the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries and also revisit some extraordinary archaeological discoveries that have ended up in museums. And in 2010, I was filming the very first series of that, which I was travelling around the country filming with my baby daughter. So I had my baby daughter with me as I travelled around the country. And I remember going down to Portsmouth to see the Mary Rose Museum and to meet the wonderful Alex Hildred, who dived on the Mary Rose back in the 1980s. And look at the archive. And the archive is just incredible. So, you know, this was one of Henry VIII's favourite ships, absolutely beautiful ship. Full of Tudor artefacts, from bowls that the crew would have used with their names scratched on them, through to the yew longbows. You know, there were so many archers on that ship. And then, you know, it was a war grave as well. It was a tomb. So there were bones as well. So incredibly well preserved bones of the sailors and the soldiers who went down with the ship. So I saw some of those bones back in 2010, and what immediately struck me was their shoulders, because I'd done my PhD on shoulders of archaeological skeletons, and I could see evidence of changes at the shoulder that I was very, very familiar with.
What did you notice about their shoulders?
I noticed that around the attachment sites for muscles around the neck of the humerus, that there were some significant changes that suggested to me that there was some damage, maybe some tendinitis in where those tendons attach. And it's a very common syndrome around the shoulder called rotator cuff disease. Mm-hmm. We tend to get it when we're older, but younger people can get it too if they overuse their shoulders.
And so what do we know about the men who were on the ship?
Well, we know that there were a lot of archers, and these archers are pulling bows with an incredible poundage. I mean, the longbow is very, very difficult to pull. It's so much heavier than bows that we use today, and they would have been training from a young age as well. So we've got this kind of circumstantial evidence that we know that there will have been lots of people who were archers from a young age, and everybody had to learn to use a longbow at that time. But these would have been people who were really specialising in it, who were, you know, they're athletes basically specialising in this, in the use of the bow. And so then we turn to look at their bones, and there's been some really interesting work looking at, for instance, the differences in the diameter of the radius, which is one of the bones in the forearm, in these skeletons, which indicates that there may be an association with archery. And what we need to do is look at the bones of modern archers, where they are pulling very heavy bows, and then look at the arms of the Mary Rose men as well. So it's an ongoing bit of research, and really writing the book sparked me to get interested again. And we have got a bit of a research project going on with those bones again, which is really fun. I like it when, you know, writing about research turns back into research again.
Yeah, so this was a group of archers who were on this boat that went down. One thing you mentioned is that these bones are very well preserved, which is interesting because I would have thought bones underwater in seawater for centuries might have disintegrated. That's sort of just instinctually what I would have thought. I don't actually know how saltwater and bone, you know, interact. But actually, why were they so well preserved?
No, actually, they're very well preserved. And I think that, you know, if you've got bones which are being preserved covered in silt, then they can be preserved extremely well underwater. So yeah, they're very, very well preserved. And many of the bones are, they're complete as well. They're not fragmented.
What do we know about how the Mary Rose went down?
Yeah, it's a sad story. So she'd had this overhaul where she'd actually been made a lot heavier in order to accommodate more cannons. Actually, what we think happened is that she turned very quickly, and that actually the covers over the cannon ports were still open, and as she turned, they just tipped into the water and water rushed in. By all accounts, she went down incredibly quickly.
Oh, wow.
And then the awful thing is that she had netting over the decks, which was to stop the enemy landing on the decks. So this kind of anti-enemy netting, anti-boarding netting. And we think that was probably one of the main reasons why so many sailors, hundreds of sailors, went down with the Mary Rose, because they're just not able. They're not able to get out. Even if they're able to get onto the deck, they're not able to get off the ship. It's
Did anyone
just
survive?
Awful. Yeah, there were some survivors, but only, really only a handful compared with the hundreds of men that were lost that day. So it was kind of it was very much a tragedy at the time. The loss of an incredible warship, state of the art warship, but also the loss of hundreds of lives.
The story of how that ship was finally lifted out of the water is pretty incredible. What do you remember about the lifting of the ship? 437 years after it went down.
I know, it's amazing. Well, there were attempts to lift it at the time because it only went down in fairly shallow water, actually, in the Solent. So in this little stretch of water between the Isle of Wight and Portsmouth, you could see the tips of the masts at low tide. So there were attempts to try and get it up. Even back in the Tudor period, which I was amazed at. It's incredible reading about that. And the Venetian divers that they brought in to try to think about salvaging that wreck, and they just couldn't. They ended up breaking a mast off. They did salvage some of the artifacts, some of the cannons from the wreck, but they gave up eventually. And then the Mary Rose was lost, and then was rediscovered by divers. And then in the 1980s, there was this incredible mission to lift her. And I remember that because it was all over the news at the time. Mm. And I remember as a kid being obsessed with this story of this incredible Tudor warship being lifted up, being brought up to the surface. That was done using equipment. There was a cradle that was placed on the seabed, and then she was lifted up onto this incredible barge. And then, of course, once the wreck has been lifted, you've then got this really big challenge of making sure that it doesn't start falling apart, because actually the wood was so well preserved. And if you go to Portsmouth today, the museum is absolutely beautiful. So the museum has got the hull of the ship in it. And I think it's getting the right way around. I think it's the left side of the ship that's largely preserved, and the right side is kind of broken away and been scattered in the tides. But you've got most of the left side of this incredible Tudor warship that was kept lying on its side for a long time, and then there was obviously a momentous day where they decided to winch it up to vertical again. So it's there in this ship gallery, in this hull gallery. And it's absolutely wonderful to be able to, walk alongside it and to see this Tudor ship and to kind of experience the physicality of it. Just incredible, as well as looking at all the artifacts that came up with it.
In 2011, you made a trip to see another group of skeletons who were killed in really harrowing and violent circumstances. How are these particular bones found?
This was an interesting site in the middle of Oxford, and it was being dug by professional archaeologists who were doing some work ahead of development at St John's College. So very standard thing in Britain. If there's some development going on, then archaeologists will scour the ground just to make sure that there's not any unexpected archaeology that's going to be destroyed by putting piles in for a new building, whatever it is they're doing. So they were digging the ground, and they found, first of all, the remains of a very ancient ditch, so a Neolithic ditch from thousands of years ago. And then also what they found was a lot of skeletons. And this was not a cemetery. So it was not well-ordered graves laid out with individuals in those graves. The skeletons were articulated, and by that I mean that they look like they were connected when the bodies were laid in the ground, like the bones were connected together. It's not just a jumble of bones.
Okay.
It's individual skeletons.
Right.
But the individual skeletons are all jumbled up and lying over each other.
Okay. So like a mass grave.
It's a mass grave. Absolutely. You're spot on. It's a mass grave of some 30 individuals who were obviously placed in this hole in the ground that was already there. They didn't, whoever did it didn't even bother to dig a grave.
Oh, gosh.
They just went, there's already a ditch here. Let's put the bodies in there. So you're looking at really not burial, you're looking at disposal.
And what was so distinctive about these skeletons?
What was distinctive about them was that, first of all, they were all relatively young men, or most of them were young men. So again, we're able to establish age at death and sex of the individuals. Absolutely every one of them had signs of weapon injury. And some of them were just atrocious. There was one skull in particular I remember looking at that had 10 weapon injuries on it. And most of those...
On just the skull?
On just the skull. Oh. On just the skull. I mean, just imagine it. And most of those weapon injuries looked as though they were created by swords. So, a long, sharp weapon making contact with the skull. And you're looking at evidence of injuries where actually any one of those injuries could have been the cause of death. And there were some skeletons where there were more evidence of injuries all over their bodies. A spear point jabbed into the front of somebody's pelvis. So it would have gone through their belly before getting into their pelvis. It was quite horrendous. I mean, so it looked like you were dealing with a group of people who had been massacred, actually, and then their bodies had been unceremoniously disposed of in this pit.
What was it like to hold those bones, knowing those people had died such awful, violent deaths? You're suddenly witness to this centuries-old act of violence.
It's quite chilling, actually, and it's interesting because obviously I'm very clinical. I didn't really use that because it sounds like doctors are not compassionate, but I'm very scientific when I'm looking at human remains. I will remove myself from that individual when I'm detailing everything and, looking at age, at death and sex of the individuals and recording all these injuries in great detail. And the osteoarchaeologist who actually did the work on these bones was called Fascination. And I was looking at the bones with Kerry. And, similarly to me, she's very scientific in her approach to them. But you can't help but being moved when you see remains like that, because you're looking at human remains of somebody who didn't not die a natural death, who died a horrendous death. What you're also doing is connecting with that moment, actually. Yeah. So when you see those injuries and those bones, you're connecting with the moment that sword made contact with that head. So it's horrendous.
It's impossible not to imagine the pain that would have inflicted.
Yeah, the pain, the terror.
Yeah.
These people were attacked from all directions. It was quite horrendous.
Do we know if these men were able to defend themselves at all?
There aren't many injuries on forearms, which we often find as kind of defensive injuries. So we don't really know. And there was nothing with them in the grave apart from one buckle. So we don't really have any evidence of that. No.
So there's a particularly horrific event in history that you were able to link this violence to. What was this event?
Well, this is an event that played out in the year 1002 under the reign of Ethelred II. He's sometimes known as Ethelred the Unready. And that's a kind of pun which kind of doesn't make sense anymore because we use the word unready in a very different way. But back in the day, Ethelred meant the good king or ready to rule. It has that kind of connotation. So unready means the good king, the bad king, or the good ruler, the bad ruler. Okay. It has that kind of connotation. Right. And it may actually be the events of 1002 which kind of play into that perhaps. But he had been facing various incursions from the Vikings on a fairly annual basis. So the Vikings would be sailing over the North Sea and also coming across the Channel because they were hanging out in harbours along the north coast of France as well, and then coming over the Channel into England and then raiding England. And they were doing this every summer. So it was like their summer sport. They'd come over and raid England and carry off whatever they could in terms of treasure, slaves, etc. And Ethelred was getting increasingly annoyed by this. And he had been paying them off. So he'd been trying to pay them off. And it was increasing sums of money. So, he would pay them off a few £1,000s one year, and then the next year they'd come back, they'd start raiding again. He'd pay them more. And they obviously thought they were onto a good thing. It's like, well, we'll do a bit of raiding and then he'll pay us thousands of pounds, which was a fortune, absolute fortune in those days. And then it comes to 1002 where he loses it, and he basically issues an edict to meet violence on people of Scandinavian heritage in England. So there'd obviously been lots of people who were of Scandinavian heritage who had already settled in England. We're very close to Scandinavia. He was annoyed about these Vikings who were coming over and raiding, and his response to that is to mete out or to sponsor this ethnic violence, basically, on people who were living in England. And he's essentially saying, if you've got a neighbour who you think might be Scandinavian, a Dane, as he put it, you can kill them. And he said this in an edict. We've got this. We've got it recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and various other historical documents as well. So, he said, you can hound them, and you can put into effect my decree as far as death. It's incredible. And he was also using hate speech as well. So we've got one particular charter where he says, go and find these Danes who've sprung up amongst us like cockle among the wheat. And that means the weeds in the wheat field. So It's like saying vermin. It's like saying vermin, weeds, all of these terms that we're, very, very alert to, that are about othering a group of people.
Genocidal language.
It is genocidal language.
And there's something about the teeth of these skeletons that tells us that they would have been victims of this particular massacre. Is that right?
Well, it certainly plays into it. So, first of all, you've got a group of skeletons that, bear all the signs of violence on them. They've been disposed of in a very unceremonial way, dumped in this ditch in Oxford. We know that there was this massacre in Oxford, and the archaeologists, were very kind of aware of this period of history. But again, that's circumstantial. You've got some skeletons which have signs of injuries on them. You've got this historical evidence of the St. Brice's Day massacre. It was carried out on St. Brice's Day in 1002. What you need to do in science, because archaeology is a science, is test ideas. So you're not trying to prove something, you're trying to dismiss it. So you have to think of ways that you could say, well, so I think these are the victims of the St. Brice's Day massacre. Well, that's all well and good. How do we disprove that? How can we use scientific techniques to try and disprove what you're saying? If we were to radiocarbon date these bones, and they came back as 18th century or 5th century, then they're clearly not the victims of the St. Brice's Day massacre in the 11th century. So radiocarbon dating was carried out on the bones. And actually, when the radiocarbon dating came back, it came back as too early.
These bones were too early for this massacre.
Yeah, the radiocarbon dating came back and said, actually, these bones date to probably the century before.
Right.
So they're probably not the St. Brice's Day massacre. I mean, the Middle Ages was a violent time, so maybe there's another episode of violence. But the archaeologists knew that there's something peculiar about radiocarbon dating, that it can be skewed young if somebody's been eating a lot of fish. It's very weird. It's very, very strange.
Right.
But if somebody's been eating a lot of fish in their diet, there's an interaction between the isotopes of carbon and the isotopes of nitrogen, and you end up with a radiocarbon date that's too young. And we found this before for Viking Age skeletons. So they looked at the nitrogen isotopes in the teeth of these individuals, and they found that indeed there was a signal of eating a lot of marine protein, fish in other words, and so actually their radiocarbon date had been skewed too young. When they adjusted it, it came back over the range that included 1002. So it looks like we have got fish eating people, and they did die around the time we could say that spans that time of the St. Brice's Day massacre.
And the fact that they were fish eating suggests they were Scandinavian heritage.
There is a distinction between people who tend to eat a lot of fish and people who eat a lot of terrestrial protein. We do see a difference between a general difference. I mean, again, it's not hard and fast, but it's a general difference between people of Viking heritage who do like their fish and people who are of more Anglo-Saxon heritage who are not eating so much fish. And we can see that within those bones, there are individuals who have particular variants of DNA which are more common in Scandinavia. And then there was that incredible link within this group of skeletons. So there's one individual from the Oxford collection of bones who is a very close relative of somebody who died and was buried on the Danish island of Funen. Those two are second-degree relatives. So we've got a family connection between Denmark and England at that point as well, which is just incredible. The other key piece of evidence that I haven't mentioned is that these bones bore signs of burning. And the burning was really odd. And it was one of the things which really sparked the archaeologists' interest as they were digging them, because they were not burned in the ditch. So it didn't look like these bodies had been placed in the ditch and then there'd been an attempt to burn them there. The charring on the bones wasn't associated with any burning in the ditch. So it looked like the bodies had been burnt elsewhere.
Okay.
And then put in the ditch. And then this actually fits with a story from Oxford itself about the St Brice's Day massacre. So we think the St Brice's Day massacre played out across England, but in Oxford itself, there's actually a charter relating to a church called St Fride's. And this charter dates to just a couple of years after the St Brice's Day massacre. And it's from Ethelred to the church, and he's clearly giving the church some money. So he's granting some money to the church. What you can understand from the charter is that he's granting, he says that he's giving money to the church because the church has been burnt down in the St Brice's Day massacre.
Right.
So what happened in Oxford during the St Brice's Day massacre is that a group of people who were thought to be of Danish heritage were hounded into the church and massacred, and the church was burnt down.
Gosh.
So the only reason we know about it is because the church then gets money to rebuild itself, or the people of the church get money to rebuild it a couple of years later. But that story of people being violently attacked, burnt in the church, and then we have this group of skeletons which have this evidence of violence, which have evidence of being burnt somewhere else and then brought into the ditch. It's all coming together to be a very, very compelling story that we have actually got the victims of the St Brice's Day massacre. It's so unusual to find archaeological evidence where we can actually join it up and marry it up with the history.
And so did examining those skeletons help rewrite the official history of that event, of the massacre?
No.
Fair enough. I guess the other question I have is, you talk about the violence that was meted out on these bones, and we have evidence of that. We can see it. Do you ever think about how archaeologists, way in the future, will look at the bones of people who die in conflicts these days? Obviously, weaponry has changed a whole lot. Yet, do you think about what future researchers will see and learn about when they look at how we lived and died?
I think for most of us, we're not going to leave much behind in terms of evidence for future archaeologists. Because I don't know what the pattern is in Australia, but certainly in Britain, most people are cremated now rather than buried.
Well, yeah.
So if you cremate a skeleton, if you cremate a body, there's nothing there for future archaeologists to look at. That very comprehensively gets rid of any kind of morphological evidence, the shape of the bones, which is what I look at. It also comprehensively destroys all the DNA. So there's nothing at all for future archaeologists to look at. So it's only from people who were buried that future archaeologists will be able to understand anything. But they will be able to go back into the past. And of course, we still have conflicts today and we still have mass burials. And I think one of the things for me, looking back on the Middle Ages, looking back on these stories from crypt, which are quite harrowing, a lot of them. You're looking at people who are dying from horrendous diseases like syphilis, the plague, leprosy. Yeah. You're looking at episodes of violence like the St Brice's Day massacre, horrendous violence, hand-to-hand violence with awful weapon injuries. But we're still doing it today. We are still, I think that in 500 years' time, if we think with a lot of the stories in the book, we're looking back 500 years to the Middle Ages, I think what we have to do is think, how far have we come in that time? We've come a long way in lots of respects. We've had amazing rights revolutions. We've had women's rights, children's rights, gay rights. We've had all these rights revolutions over the last 100, 150 years. We've improved longevity amazingly. We've reduced childhood mortality incredibly. What we haven't done brilliantly is spreading those effects all around the world.
Right.
And there's a big challenge there to do that, to make sure that what we enjoy in developed countries is extended around the world. And I hope that we will continue to do that. But then on the other hand, we still have this violence. Yeah. We still have interpersonal violence, which is, I think, less than it was in the Middle Ages, largely. But we also have states going to war with each other. And I do think that in 500 years' time, I hope the trajectory that we've seen will carry on going. I hope that we move further in the direction of peace and tolerance and living together well. And I hope that in 500 years' time, people will look back and go, goodness me, they thought they were so civilised in the 21st century, but they're not that much different to the Middle Ages in that respect.
Yeah, right. What sort of story do you hope your own bones will tell one day?
Well, I am probably going to have to donate my body to medical science because I have benefited so much over the course of my career from all those generous people who donate their bodies to medical schools so that medical students can learn, our future doctors can learn. It's still the best way of learning. It's better than any of the books or models that we can look at. So that means probably I will ultimately be cremated, so leave very little in terms of my legacy. But I do also sometimes think that I would like to be buried in the style of a Bronze Age person.
Oh?
I think if I didn't have that,
Which is what, crouched over in the little pit?
Yes, exactly. So I'd be buried as a crouch burial with a lovely pot. And actually, a friend has given me a very beautiful replica of a Bronze Age beaker, so I have that ready. The only reason for doing that really is that I like those styles of burial and that it would really confuse archaeologists of the future.
Is she a Bronze Age woman or a 21st century woman? Alice, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Anatomist, biological anthropologist, author and broadcaster Alice Roberts. And her book about listening to skeletons is called Crypt. This conversation was created on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Nicola Harrison was the producer, and our executive producer is Carmel Rooney. I'm Sana Kadar. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.